I'm Usha George. I'm a professor at the School of Social Work and the director of the Ryerson Centre for Immigration and Settlement. As of now, I have 3 research projects that are affiliated to the center. One is a SHERC-funded study on the citizenship experiences of South Asian and Chinese women. What I'm exploring there is when immigrants become citizens, do they see a change in the way they feel in Canada, or what are their new experiences? Are they experiencing anything different from what they were 5 years ago when they were new immigrants? So the study explores the ideas around belonging, identity, and community participation, and how this is conceptualized by women from these racialized communities. The second project I'm working on is on the entrepreneurship behavior of new immigrants. We have adequate data demonstrating that a large number of new businesses are started by new immigrants. And I'm curious about what prompts them to go into business, even though I have an idea why they are doing that, but I just wanted to explore that further to see if people are going into business, what can we do in order to assist them, and what are their motivations and so on. So this study is funded by Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. It's in the second year, and we are in the process of again doing a survey of new businesses in and around the GTA. The third project I'm working on is the Syrian refugee resettlement, the process, and also exploring the role of social capital in the settlement process of Syrian refugees. This study is funded by, again, SHERC. It's a partnership grant with a number of partners, community partners. So we have collected focus group data from men and women who have been resettled Syrian refugees. Now we are in the process of developing a survey for these individuals. Again, this is in the second year of the project is in its second year. The citizenship study, from the data that we collected so far, which is basically from individual interviews, people are talking about hybrid identities. In other words, they are Indo-Canadian, or they are Bangladeshi Canadian, or they are Chinese Canadian. None of them feel like they want to say they are totally Canadian or totally Chinese. So that's something we already know, but this is confirmed by the study. And many of them feel a sense of belonging to Canada, a sense of permanence, a sense that they don't have to move around because Canada offers them not only lifelong, the ability to stay here lifelong, and to have their families here forever. And they feel that, especially people who have been in transit for a number of years, or who have been in transit countries, feel like this is the end, this is the stop, final stop. So they do have a sense of belonging. At the same time, many of them also have experienced discrimination and racism, and many of these women have actually spoken about that as well. That's the kind of a major finding so far. In terms of social participation, we don't see a lot of that. They talk about voting and participating in voting and so on, but many of them are active in their own ethnic communities, not necessarily in the mainstream community, even though I should add that there are some who are extremely active in the mainstream community. The Syrian project, I just want to say that we had, we went into this research, or we had the assumption that privately sponsored refugees are doing better than government-sponsored refugees. It is acknowledged that there is a difference in the background of these two groups of refugees, but the data we collected so far does not indicate that the privately sponsored refugees have, are much better settled than government-sponsored refugees, even though I should add that it's only preliminary data. We haven't gone into the details yet. Long time ago, I was a graduate student in the United States. At that time, I wasn't studying immigrants or refugees or anyone like that. I was doing my graduate studies in sociology and social psychology. But naturally, I became connected to a number of individuals in my own ethnic community, and I was intrigued by the way in which they sort of conducted themselves to be, Indians at the same time Americans, and how integrated or not integrated they were in the mainstream of activities in I suppose in Chicago. So many of them sort of spend their time along with their ethnic community, their church communities, their families, but their connections with the outside world was very limited, and that sure. And during that process, I also realized that there are if they were introduced to the mainstream in a very different way, they could have been more involved. So that's where it started. But when I finished my PhD much later, and then when I came to Canada, that seemed like that's the place I wanted to start with. At the same time, my first job was in a community agency serving South Asians, and there also the whole notion of settlement needs and whole idea of integration and the specific needs of racialized women came into much more into focus, and therefore when I started at University of Toronto, that was naturally my inclination to follow and see where it takes me. I'm really interested in research. I love the whole notion of exploring things and finding whether it is something new or just confirming what we know through our own common sense. I'm always sort of intrigued about those things around immigration and integration. I joined University of Toronto in 1994 as an assistant professor. Soon after I got tenure, I became an administrator, and throughout my stay at University of Toronto and later on at Ryerson, I spent majority of my time, actually until 2007, in academic administrative work. At the same time, my passion for research was there, so I managed to carry on the research projects as I wanted to have them. But I would add that maybe I could have done more if I were not in academic administration, but definitely I'm not in justifying that. But I've been extremely successful in getting research grants. So my early work at University of Toronto from about 1996 to 2006 was studying a large number of newcomer groups about their settlement needs. During that time, the then Citizenship and Immigration Canada was curious about the settlement needs of many newcomer groups as they were coming in. So I was quite successful in getting grants to examine the settlement needs of many of these groups. For example, former Yugoslavian migrants, immigrants, African newcomers, Chinese mainland newcomers, Iraqi refugees from Iraq, Afghan refugees. So there were quite a number of these groups that had come in, and I was successful to get grants to sort of examine their settlement needs. We start from the point of view that everybody's settlement needs are different, and they are all, as they are coming from very different backgrounds. But eventually we found that almost everybody had similar or same settlement needs. That is, the need for employment, for housing, for language instruction, for establishing social networks, and knowledge about available services and so on. But what was distinct about these groups was some of them had experienced traumatic experiences, and some of them definitely wanted linguistic and culturally sensitive services. So those were the kind of differences between them, but generally the settlement needs were very similar. And so later on I was able to work with Citizenship and Immigration Canada to design a number of programs that would make settlement services more accessible to newcomers. For example, the Settlement Worker in Schools program is definitely one that provided access to settlement services in the school system, because school is where most of the newcomers would go first. I did an evaluation of the program in different cities in Ontario, in Toronto area. Now it's a fully funded program for the last 15 or so years. So that's the first period of my research career, I'd say. Later on, I moved on to, and along with this, I also examined sort of the, from an intersectional point of view, the immigrant women and their settlement needs and their vulnerabilities. In as much as I found that there are some challenges that immigrant women face as a result of these intersectionalities, I also found that these women had a great deal of agency. They were literally innovators, they were go-getters. They went and looked for things that they could do, they could find. In fact, some of them even found jobs for their own husbands. So that's an area that I have examined quite a bit. And then the third area, naturally coming from these, is how to work, especially in social work, with diverse communities. What are their needs, and how do we make sure that social work and responds to the needs of these racialized immigrants. So with my colleague Kat Sang at U of T, we developed a model for working for clinical practice. And then we also advocated, or we also proposed models where organizational change has to happen, because in as much as you work with individuals, it's also important to work to change the system, which will have to accommodate the needs of the newcomers and to respond to their diverse needs. So we organized or developed a model for diversity and organizational change. So these are the three sort of interrelated areas that I have worked on. Recently, I'm more into more sociological examination of immigrant needs in terms of citizenship and so on. But this is how my kind of career moved along.